Welcome to week 2 lecture. Again, we'll be doing this remotely. We're going to split this up into 2 different sections. So you are listening to part 1 of 2 of the Transformed West and New South. And today I'm mainly going to be talking about how the West was transformed following the Civil War. Last week in talking about Reconstruction, I mentioned that part of the South's economic stagnation following the Civil War was due to a lot of competition for investment with the West. The West is where capitalism was expanding the most rapidly and the most dramatically. There's some expansion in land grabs, but not a ton of permanent settlement prior to this. And then after the war, this really changes. So the Western frontier from the beginning of the United States was seen as a place where American culture could be forged, where Americans could step forth into the unknown and display their rugged individualism, practice political democracy at its most pure, and show the economic mobility that was required or a part of the American dream. It's also seen as a safety valve to Eastern life, a place where if you get tired of the toil and trouble of Eastern city life, then you could strike out on your own in the West as a place of opportunity. Most settlers who went west went as families, not necessarily the lone pioneer that we often think of. The West was a very diverse region. I think we think of the West as a plains, right? Wide open plains where the buffalo roam. And certainly there are a lot of plains in these Western frontiers, but there's also a lot of mountainous areas and deserts. And because it's such a large piece of territory, the incorporation of the West into the United States required active intervention on the part of the U.S. government. So the U.S. government had to be actively involved in acquiring and settling the western portions of the United States. Some of the things that the U.S. government had to be involved in directly: acquiring Indian land by war and by treaty, administering land sales, regulating territory politics, distributing land and money to farmers, and regulating railroad and mining industries. The federal government also sponsored irrigation systems and dams starting in the 1900s. Western settlement was also promoted in European countries and Eastern cities as an easy way to get a piece of land. Many people who wanted to move west gained land through the Homestead Act, or land speculators, or even railroad companies that were selling off excess land that they didn't plan to use to build railroad on. The West was seen as this new area for wheat and corn production and the ability to sell those products. And you see in the West a really diverse group of farmers. And farming in the West was not an easy task, a very difficult terrain, not to mention like the rattlesnakes and other animals that they wouldn't have been necessarily used to that may cause trouble. But the plains also had very extreme weather patterns. They continue to have extreme weather patterns today. Things like massive blizzards in the winter and very serious droughts in the summer, which you can imagine. Droughts in an area that you want to farm, not necessarily the most easy thing to get around. And most of the burden of these problems in farming in the West often fell on women. But the West was more of just a farming empire. In the West, actually, more people lived in cities than they did in rural areas. And a lot of the primary economic activities that are happening, like farming and mining, really are large corporate enterprises that evolved from small-scale production. So you have these large corporations or large industries that are centered in the north, things like lumber, mining through gold and silver rushes, sheep ranching, and then, of course, large industrial farming. But the West, while a site of economic expansion and growth for the United States, was ultimately very tragic for Plains Indians. As settlers encroached on their land, conflict ensued. U.S. generals, and we have to keep in mind that the U.S. military is actively out in the West. As whites take over land, the military is there, and generals try to do everything that they can to destroy the Indian economies. They destroy villages, they kill their horses, they kill buffalo, and really render the buffalo by the end of the 1800s pretty much all but extinct. And these actions break one tribe after another, and they're removed to different reservations that are set up in new Indian territories. Nez Perce leader Chief Joseph actually gave a speech in Washington, D.C. condemning the reservation policy, and in it used American language of freedom. And while there's a lot of negatives and a lot of tragedies for Plains Indians, there were some small victories. One such victory was Little Bighorn, which was a small battle that happened in June of 1876, where a group of Sioux and Cheyenne natives that were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeated General Custer and his 250 men, defending their tribal land in the Black Hills in the Dakota Territory. Whites had invaded this land during events happening in the Southwest with the Apaches. But while this was a small victory, and it certainly was a victory for Native resistance, it delayed the onward march of white settlers and prospectors temporarily, because between the end of the Civil War in 1890, 8 new Western states entered the Union. Railroads crisscrossed the plains, farmers and ranchers used Native American land, and most Native Americans were confined to reservations and living in poverty and being preyed on by government agents. Part of the issues that Natives and the American government had is that Native ideas of freedom conflicted with American goals. Most Americans and government officials supported Indian surrender of lands and Indian way of life. In 1871, Congress eliminated the treaty system, so Native Americans were no longer considered independent nations. They were seen as subjects of the United States. The Bureau of Indian Affairs established boarding schools where they removed Native children from their parents and their tribes in order to kill off Native culture. It's the easiest way to kill off Native culture, to kill off a culture, is to remove that culture from the next generation, and they're no longer able to pass it on. So when these children are removed from their parents and sent to these boarding schools, they would be given new American names. They would be made to wear non-Indian clothing and be given a white American education. The Dawes Act, passed by Congress, broke up tribal lands into small parcels and were then distributed to Indian families. And if these Indian families accepted the land, then they would have to become American and then could have the advantage of becoming a citizen. But very few took advantage of those possibilities. And because of this, you see a large loss of Indian land and culture. The Supreme Court even weighs in on the topic of Indian citizenship in Elk versus Wilkins in 1884. And basically what the Supreme Court rules in this case is that the rights of the 14th and 15th Amendment do not apply to Native Americans. Even those who attempted to become American still were not considered civilized enough, and ultimately the Supreme Court didn't even think that Natives were capable of becoming civilized. And so all of this tumult in the Native world, leads to a sort of religious revival, something you can think of like the Second Great Awakening or the Great Awakening, that those times of major upheaval, people tend to seek solace in religion, and you see the same type of thing happening with natives. But their religious revitalization campaign was known as the Ghost Dance, and the Ghost Dance was basically, they would have large gatherings where they would talk about how there would be a day when the white men would leave and the buffalo would reappear, and then they would be free to practice their own culture again. But because they're practicing in large gatherings and they're talking about hoping that the whites leave, certainly the U.S. government feels threatened by that and actually sent troops to kind of oversee these gatherings. Ultimately, that does not end well, and on December 29th of 1890, a group of U.S. soldiers opened fire on ghost dancers near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They ended up killing 150 to 200 natives, mostly women and children. This event, Wounded Knee, is seen as kind of the end of Indian resistance. It is certainly the last armed conflict. It is not the end of Native American resistance. You do see, there's small things that happen from this time in 1890 all the way up into the 1960s, but in the 1960s and 1970s, you see a large resurgence of American resistance that kind of is born out of the civil rights movement.